Hi, my name is Tommy Allen, and I'm the lead pastor of New Hope Presbyterian Church, and we are glad that you are here. Today is our sixth sermon in a series entitled Guess Who's Coming to Dinner on Race, Ethnicity, and Missions. And I'm really excited about today's. It's a follow-up from last week's, which if you listened to last week's sermon, it was about the mixed multitude that left Egypt during the Exodus and how many of those in the mixed multitude were Cushites or black Africans. Today we're going to narrow that story down to one African who became very famous in Israel. So let me read the text this morning and then we will pray and then I will jump right in. So from Numbers chapter 25, verses 1 through 13. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, "Take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel." And Moses said to the judges of Israel, "Each of you kill those men who have yoked himself to the Baal of Peor." And behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel, while they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he rose and left the congregation and took a spear in his hand and went after the man of Israel into the chamber and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through her belly. Thus the plague on the people of Israel was stopped. Nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. And the Lord said to Moses, "Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, Behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and to his descendants after him the covenant of a perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the people of Israel." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let me pray. Father, I pray this morning that you would come and you would open the eyes of the blind and the ears of the deaf. You would give us insight into this passage. I pray that you would be in my head and in my thinking and in my heart and in my understanding and in my mouth and in my speaking. In Jesus' name we pray these things. Amen and amen. So I'm going to start with a question, as I often do, but this question is going to be a little bit, it's going to seem like it's coming from left field, but I promise it will tie in by the end. And so let me ask you this. What is your EQ? What is EQ? In other words, what is your emotional quotient, right? You've heard of IQ, intelligence quotient. What's your EQ? In other words, EQ is a measure of emotional intelligence, and let me define that for you from the American Dictionary of Psychology. It says emotional intelligence is most often defined as the ability to perceive, use, understand, and manage emotions. People with high emotional intelligence can recognize their own emotions and those of others, use emotional information to guide thinking and behavior, and discern between different feelings and label them appropriately, and adjust emotions to adapt to environments. So in other words, you are emotionally intelligent when it comes to dealing with other people, and emotionally intelligent when it comes to dealing with your own emotions and feelings. And you're just, in some ways, you just seem like a smart person, but it's the way you are in relationships. So for example, let's imagine you're a man, and you and your wife are invited to this big dinner party at your office, or a big union party, or your medical practice, whatever it is. You're invited to this big party. Your wife spends a lot of time getting ready, and she comes out and says, "Does my hair look okay?" Let's suppose it doesn't really. Well, the low EQ answer would be, "No, it looks horrible." That's not going to do anyone any favors, right? Certainly not you. Now, what would the person with a high emotional quotient, how would answer that question? Your wife comes out and says, "Honey, does my hair look okay?" Clearly, she's not comfortable. "Does my hair look okay?" And then the high EQ person would say, "If you're asking me whether or not you're going to be the most beautiful woman in the room tonight, the answer is absolutely yes." Smart answer. That's what I'm talking about. And so emotional intelligence is basically measured in 5 different areas, right? There's self-awareness, the ability to know one's emotions, strengths, weaknesses, drives, values, etc. Self-regulation involves controlling or redirecting one's disruptive emotions. social skill, managing relationships to get along with others, empathy, considering other people's feelings, especially when making decisions, and motivation, being aware of what motivates them. The last two are what I'm concerned about as we go into this sermon, and considering what other people are feeling, what other people have experienced, and being aware of what motivates other people. Why is that so important for this sermon and for this, really for this series that we're doing? I mean, we're doing the series on race, ethnicity, and mission, not just for the information's sake. We're doing it because of where we live, right? If you live in Kent, Washington, 60% of our neighbors are people of color. 60% of our neighbors are not white people. Do we understand what motivates them? Do we understand what they've been through? Do we have some sense of empathy toward them that we can enter in and that we can actually have a relationship with them? And lots of other things, right? The racial situation in our country. So the bottom line is, my hope for this sermon and really the whole series is that for our predominantly, but not exclusively, white church, that we would raise our corporate emotional intelligence, that corporately we would be more empathetic and more understanding of the motivation of other people, especially other churches and churches that are not like ours, so that we might actually be in mission with them. Unless we have high emotional intelligence, we're not going to be able to do that. So hopefully we'll get there. Today, as we look at this passage about Phinehas, it's going to be interesting because Phinehas is basically, the name Phinehas means the Cushite. And if you remember, I talked about last week, Cushites in the Bible are black Africans, like people who are like really dark skinned. And Phinehas, the name Phinehas means the Cushite. It's an Egyptian name. PH is a definite article. It means the, and Phinehas in Egyptian means dark one, or the Nubian, or the Cushite. This name was given to people with particularly dark skin. So that'll come in handy later to understand that. But what we're going to look at today is basically three things. We're going to look at a sneak attack, an improvised intercession, and a perpetual priesthood. So a sneak attack, an improvised intercession, and a perpetual priesthood. Sneak attack comes from my favorite Netflix series, Kim's Convenience, where the father, Korean father, is always like, almost sneak attack me, right? That's what we're going to look at right now, sneak attack. So if you think about it, the context of the book of Numbers, do you even know what the book of Numbers is about? Understanding that helps us with the whole context. Basically, the book of Numbers in Hebrew, the title of the book of Numbers is in the wilderness or in the desert. And if you remember, Israel left Egypt and they entered the wilderness en route to the promised land, Canaan. And that journey should have taken them about maybe 9 months, people estimate. Instead, it took them 40 years. Now the question is, why would it take them 40 years to take a journey that should have only taken 1 year? The answer is in the book of Numbers. Right, in the book of Numbers, you see all these things come up, whether it's Israel's sin, whether it's their rebellion, whether it's their complaining, and also the context right before our passage, you have hostile people. Between Egypt and Canaan, there are a lot of hostile nations that Israel has to get through in order to get to the promised land, which is also filled with hostile nations and hostile people. So if you get to chapter 21 in the book of Numbers, what you see is that Israel is sort of on a roll, like good things are happening for Israel. They're on a roll and they defeat these two kings that are brothers, and they are most likely giants, like Goliath type giants. And their names are Sihon and Og. They defeat them. And as they defeat people like this, other nations around them are going, oh boy, what are we going to do with these people? Like they heard they had come out of Egypt, and they're saying, this people that has come out from Egypt, they're swarming the land like locusts. How can we stop them? And this one king, Balak, he decides that he can't, at least in his own power. He doesn't have the military strength to take on Israel, especially given the role that she's on. And so he does what any good king would do, is he goes to Balaam. And many of you are familiar with Balaam. And Balaam is basically a pagan prophet, and Balak goes to Balaam and he offers to pay him a lot of money. He says, I want you to curse Israel's, or curse them by their God. And he does that 3 times, and 3 times Balaam actually tries. He wants to curse Israel, but he just can't. It's almost like he goes to curse them, and instead blessing comes out of his mouth. And he has 3 confrontations with God, right? We do a lot of sermons on those. Remember, that's the sermon where Balaam's ass talks, right? That he sees the angel of the Lord, and he talks to him, and he says, why do you treat me thus? Because he's beating him. All that to say is Balaam can't curse them. That's the strategy of hiring a pagan prophet to curse Israel doesn't work. However, Balaam, after he does that, he says, now let us take counsel. He comes up with a different idea. Now, in other words, if we can't get Israel's God to curse them, if we can't get Israel's God to abandon them, what if we could get Israel to abandon their God? In other words, if they need their God to fight and he won't abandon them, what if they abandon him? And that's the sneak attack. That's what they do. In other words, instead of doing the sort of above board cursing, like I guess you would do in the ancient Near East, they go in through a different route. The means that they use to take down Israel in this situation are means that have taken down many a soldier. Food and sex. In other words, every soldier, at least male soldier that I've ever known, has some interest in food and sex, especially if they've been out in the field for a long time, like Israel had been. So notice what verse 1 says here. It says, while Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. The word there, whore, doesn't necessarily mean sleeping with them, or it means at least sleeping with them, but it means more than that, because it's actually a word that is only ever used of female adulterers usually. And so he's saying the whole nation began to whore with the daughters of Moab. They began to sleep with them, but there's something more going on here. What happens? It says, they began to whore with the daughters of Moab. Verse 2, these invited the people to sacrifices of their gods, and the peoples ate and bowed down to their gods. Verse 3, so Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. So the process is this. They were lured in by Moabite women by the prospect of sex. And while they were there, they were asked, hey, you want to participate in sacrifices? What that meant was after the sacrifices, we get to have a feast on the meat that was sacrificed to these false gods. And it says, so they invited them to sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate, Israel ate, and they bowed down to their gods. So they went from just being lured in by sex to eating their food to bowing down to their gods. And once they did that, it was game over. But the word here, whoring, is important because it didn't mean they were just sleeping with Moabite women. It encompasses the whole situation here in the fact that it's a feminine verb used of male soldiers. And basically what it's getting at is they were committing spiritual adultery. By bowing down to Baal of Peor, instead of being faithful to Yahweh, their God, they were committing spiritual adultery. And the problem with that is God is a jealous God, right? He says that in the 10 Commandments. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, have no other gods before me. And so now they're whoring, and Israel is God's bride, and God is basically put in this position of a dishonored husband who has been flagrantly cheated upon by his unfaithful wife. And it says the anger of the Lord kindled against them, you think? And then God basically says this. He demands justice. It says in verse 4, and the Lord said to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. And Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor. Number one, God says, I want you to make an example out of all the chiefs of the people. In other words, the chiefs that let their people go do this, I want you to make an example of them. And he says, I want you to hang them in the sun before the Lord. Hanging them in the sun before the Lord, that sounds bad, but it's actually a lot worse than that, because the word there really means to impale them. Impale them in the sun before the Lord, and let them hang out, and let the buzzards pick their flesh and the birds eat their eyes out. And it would just be this disgusting, horrible, cursed thing, right? And that's Deuteronomy says, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. They would have been impaled. And then he says, now all these other people that actually did the whoring, that actually did this practice, kill them. Now there's precedent for this. This story is very much like the story of the golden calf, when Moses came down the mountain and Israel was dancing and have a party around the golden calf. And remember, Moses said, who is it that stands on the Lord's side? And the Levites, it says, arose and basically killed 3,000 people. Now, the Levites were pretty fierce warriors. And it's interesting that these very fierce warriors are the ones that became priests of the temple. And that's basically what's going on here. He says, so now the people who have committed this offense need to be killed. And I would expect the Levites would have done that. The interesting thing here is we read these kind of passages and it's easy to feel very removed from them and feel like, oh, Israel was so bad. And we always laugh at Israel and like, oh, take another lap around the desert. But the fact is that you and I are not much different than Israel, right? We're not much different than Israel in that we complain a lot. I complain a lot. Church members complain a lot. I know, not all the time, but and it comes in waves. But nonetheless, we complain a lot. We get angry. We feel like God has abandoned us, but also we abandon God. We commit spiritual adultery all the time. How do you know you're committing spiritual adultery? Well, you're committing spiritual adultery anytime you put your hope and comfort in anything but God himself, right? If your hope and comfort is in having a good family, and if you would be devastated until like almost suicidal if you lost your family or it didn't work out the way you wanted, or if it's about having money or the right career or about getting married or about being single, whatever it is, if your hope is in that thing, ultimately not only will it disappoint you, but it also is spiritual adultery. And in the case of spiritual adultery, which is all of us, God demands the justice of a jealous husband. It's as simple as that. And we tend to think, at least I think people tend to think of the gospel and in terms of sort of math, like, okay, God is angry, we have to assuage his anger, and the cross is all the math for that. That's true. But the reality is the reason God is angry, it's not the anger of a parent who's just like, I can't believe you screwed up. It's the anger of someone who loves you so passionately and so deeply, and yet you have turned your back on him, and yet you have scorned him, and yet you've committed adultery upon him. All of us have. I remember when I was at FSU, Florida State University, go Noles. I had a religion professor there named Dr. Moore. And on one hand, he was a very sweet guy, but he was also this sort of old school. I can imagine him teaching this passage and saying, now this, students, is a classic example of the Old Testament God of wrath. And I remember sitting there, I was a pretty new Christian, but I remember sitting in the class thinking, seems like there's a lot of wrath in the New Testament too. Like Ananias and Sapphira, they tell a lie and they get struck dead. That seems pretty like extra. But the reality is the most wrath in the whole Bible, the epitome of wrath in the whole Bible is the cross of Jesus. The complete and utter outpouring of God's wrath against all sin, against all the curse, against all humanity who would commit spiritual adultery against him, was poured into one person, Jesus. And so when Jesus went to the cross, he wasn't going to set us a good example. He wasn't showing us how to be self-sacrificial. When Jesus went to the cross, he went as our substitute. And because Jesus went as our substitute, God's honor is preserved, his justice is served, and ultimately his mercy is extended because there's nothing left to do. Everything has been taken care of. A sin has been atoned for. Righteousness can even be given because of the work of Jesus on the cross. Have you embraced that? Have you experienced that? Because the same thing happens in the story that we're reading today. It's just like the Old Testament version of that. Here's what we see in this story with Phinehas is basically an improvised intercession where the cross of Jesus was intentional and planned from the very beginning. At least from Phinehas' perspective, he's improvising. He's going to act on behalf of God. And notice what he does. In verse 6, it says, "And behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family, or his brothers, in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel, while they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting." In verse 6, some time has passed, apparently, and Israel has gotten the message. Israel is gathering around the tent of meeting, and they're mourning and they're weeping. It sounds like they're trying to repent of their sin. And while they are having this meeting to try and deal with their sin, to try and repent of it, to weep over it, to mourn over it, some Yahoo, some guy, his name is given to us actually later. His name is Zimri. So Zimri was his name. This guy Zimri comes like, tiptoeing through the congregation with this Midianite woman who he plans on sleeping with, who in fact he did sleep with. And it says he's bringing her to his brothers. It doesn't say relatives, it says brothers. Like, who knows if he planned on passing her around. It's flagrant disobedience, not just flagrant disobedience, but flagrant disobedience while everyone else is actually trying to get right with God. And so Phinehas can't take anymore. What does Phinehas do? It says, when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose and left the congregation and took a spear in his hand and went after the man of Israel into the chamber and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. Thus the plague on the people was stopped. Phinehas sees what's going on. He's going to take action. He leaves the congregation, he picks up a spear, he goes into where the man and the woman apparently are having sex, and he shish kebabs them, right? Both of them. And it says he shish kebabs them through her belly. Now, by the way, that's not the word belly in Hebrew, but it's a family program, so I'm not going to talk about it. Nonetheless, he shish kebabs them and kills them both. And immediately, it says, thus the wrath of the Lord was stopped. And verse 8, it says, thus a plague on the people of Israel was stopped. Verse 9, nevertheless, those who died by the plague was 24,000. So about 2,000 people from each of the tribes of Israel had already died. And Phinehas stops it. Phinehas intercedes, and he stops the wrath of God going upon all Israel, actually by sacrificing 2 people in the midst of fornication. He shish kebabs them. Now, what was so significant about this one act, and this one pretty brutal act, to be honest with you, that would assuage the wrath of God and gain such high praise for Phinehas? Because it does. We find out in the next few verses where we talk about a perpetual priesthood. It says in verse 10, and the Lord said to Moses, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and to his descendants after him a covenant of a perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the people of Israel. So what's happening here? So verse 10, God's response to Phinehas's act is he tells Moses, here's what I want you to tell Phinehas, that Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not consume my people Israel in jealousy. In other words, Phinehas was empathetic, but Phinehas wasn't empathetic toward people. He was empathetic toward God. He had high emotional intelligence. He understood God's pain and God's jealousy so much that he actually felt it himself. He says that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, and he so understood it that he felt like he had to act by faith to mitigate it, to stop it, to stop what was happening to God. And in fact, this event is so important, that Phinehas' actions, that Psalm 106 verses 28 through 31 recounts the story, and the story culminates by saying, and it was counted to him as righteousness. In other words, Phinehas' act here, apparently he acted by faith, and it says that God counted that to him as righteousness. Does that sound familiar? It should. The only other person in the Old Testament about whom God says that is Abraham. Remember Father Abraham, where this all started, that God's covenant, that he would make his descendants greater than the stars of the heaven, and he would bless those who blessed him and curse those who curse him. And Abraham believed, and it says, and God counted that to him as righteousness. And that, by the way, is the paradigm of the New Testament too. That's what Paul says. Just like for Abraham, it was counted unto righteousness. And just like to Phinehas, it was counted to righteousness. So our faith will be counted to us as righteousness. So that's one thing. The second thing, and if you look at verses 12 and 13, it says, therefore say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and to his descendants after him a covenant of a perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the people of Israel. He basically says, I make with him a covenant of peace, and then he expands on that with the covenant of a perpetual priesthood. And the word there is something you're familiar with if you're used to listening to me. It's a covenant of shalom. The things are going to be the way they are supposed to be with him. And he says, I make for him a covenant of a perpetual priesthood. Now, what's important about that? Well, it's important for us because what that means, if the priesthood is perpetual, and God has just made an unconditional covenant. Remember that with Abraham. There's no conditions on it. He just promises that this is going to happen through Phinehas. So through Phinehas, there will be a perpetual priesthood, which means there will always be someone to intercede on behalf of God's people to God. There will always be someone who can mediate for them. There will always be someone who can make atonement. We find out in the book of Hebrews that that person ultimately that perpetual priesthood would culminate in the person of Jesus. He would be the one who would always mediate for us. He would be the one who would always be there to intercede for us. He would be there as the one who made atonement for us. But God says that line will come through Phinehas. That through him, what this is doing is establishing the high priesthood. Remember, Israel had a high priest that did all the functions, that all the high priests in Israel from this point out would be descendants of Phinehas. So all these races and nations that are mixed and mingled, they're all over the place, but they culminate in this case in Phinehas the Cushite, the line of the high priesthood. Now, added to all this, I just want to remind you that Phinehas is black, or at least he is half black, right? His grandfather and his grandmother would have come from a place that would be analogous maybe to modern day Sudan. So he was at least half black by lineage, but he probably looked very black because he was named Phinehas, the Cushite. Why does this matter? Why am I bringing this up? I'm coming to the end here. Why would I finish by just making the point that this guy did all these great things and he happened to be black? And the answer is simply this. In a perfect world, it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter a bit. Why would it? On the other hand, we don't live in a perfect world. In fact, in where I'm standing in June of 2021, we live in a country that has a history of slavery, of enslaving black Africans. We have a country that has enforced things like Jim Crow laws and enforced things like laws against interracial marriage, all of these things. So there are some things that have happened. Some of them systemic, some of them not systemic. Some of them just outright evil, and some of them probably just sort of like evil that happened because people were being apathetic. Nonetheless, it's there. It's an elephant in the room. And it's an elephant that is becoming louder and louder and louder. Other issue is that if you are a black Christian, and maybe your family has been Christians and been in the black church for generations, it seems to me you would have every right to say, you know, all these things were happening to us, and the white church, generally speaking, didn't have our backs. They didn't say anything. They didn't do anything. They were just there. And so now we are called in mission. We have always been called, but now as we look at race, ethnicity, and mission, how are we to work together with churches that are different than ours when there's this sort of elephant in the room? If white Christians historically, generally speaking, had spent as much time properly interpreting Phinehas and looking at Phinehas and what Phinehas did and what his being a Cushite meant, rather than improperly interpreting passages that had to do with slavery, we might be in a different position now. And so there were people who proactively did wrong, but there are also people who just thought, you know, it ain't my problem. It is now. And we all have to deal with it. Let me read you this passage from Daniel Hayes, his book, From Every People and Nation. He talks about Phinehas. And he says, imagine the different route American Christianity might have traveled if the translators of the King James Bible had known Egyptian and had thus translated Phinehas as the Negro. Early Americans would have read that God made an eternal covenant with the Negro, that all legitimate priests are descended from the Negro, that God credited righteousness to the Negro. With such clear texts available, it would have been extremely difficult to defend slavery or to maintain any type of superiority or inferiority racial views. In other words, why is it important that we understand this? It's important to understand it because when the Bible is interpreted improperly or things are left out that should be maybe made a point of, bad things happen and we end up where we are now. Think of it this way. You know, many of you know that my father passed away a couple weeks ago. I wasn't alienated from him, but nor did I know him well. And I was thinking about the relationship of the black church generally and the white church generally, and what white people don't really get about the situation. And I started thinking about my dad. Basically, my dad left when I was 5 or 6, and I saw him a few times growing up. And about 20 years ago, we both ended up in the Pacific Northwest, and I thought, you know what, I'm a Christian, I'm a pastor, I need to set the example, I need to initiate with him, and talk to him and acknowledge him and forgive him. I did. And I remember driving my whole family down to Portland or Salem at the time. And my girls were at like maximum cute stage. And I said, Dad, I forgive you for like not being there when I was a kid. And you know what? You have a clean slate with your grandchildren. You can do whatever you want. And he never took me up on it. And that was disappointing. So about 6 or 7 years ago, he had a stroke and was put in a sort of a convalescent care place. His mind was okay, but his body didn't work, so he couldn't move. And I went down there several times to try again. I'm going to go down and see, like, okay, Dad, let's do this. And what was interesting is even though I forgave him, we never made any progress, ever, like zero progress. And why didn't we make any progress? I think the reason we didn't make any progress is that he never asked a question about me. He never asked a question about my childhood, which after he left was especially abusive. It was especially neglectful. It was especially traumatic. He never asked. So he didn't know. And I think if he had asked and he had shown any concern and I had told him, all I would have hoped for was him to say, wow, I didn't know that. I'm sorry. Like, he didn't even need to apologize for the fact that he was responsible for it. Just the fact that, like, whoa, I'm sorry that happened to you. But he never did. All he talked about was himself. All he talked about was like things that were general, and so we never could go anywhere. And in other words, we couldn't go because it not only would take forgiveness to restore this relationship, but it would take an acknowledgement on behalf of the offending party. And is that to say all white people are the offending party? No. But can the majority of white people and majority of white churches talk to their black brothers and sisters and begin to see have their eyes opened to what our black brothers and sisters have gone through and start to say, wow, I didn't know. I'm sorry. I think if we did that, that would be the beginning of this huge movement of the gospel. I mean, we spent all this time talking about, should we be studying critical race theory, or should we be studying white fragility, or can we not put ourselves in someone else's shoes and just be honest and say, I didn't know, and I'm sorry that happened. How do we move forward? I bet you it would change the world. Think about that. Let me pray for us. Father, I pray now that you would begin a movement of the gospel among all churches, white churches, black churches, Asian churches, Polynesian churches, whatever kind of races, that we would be working together for the sake of the world, that we would be a blessing to all the nations, just as Abraham was called to be, and all those who are his children are called to be as well. In his name we pray, amen, and amen, and amen. So at this point in the service, we would sing the doxology and we would have an offertory where we would basically put the digital giving information on the screen. So if you're interested in giving, knock yourself out. We are very thankful for that. Let me send you from this place with this virtual blessing, reminding you that the Lord your God shouts over you with great shouts of joy. Leave this virtual place with that hope. Amen and amen.